All right, let's start our exploration of Linux. Linux begins with a man named Linus Torvalds, and many people have heard of him, some never have. But Linus basically created Linux, and we'll get to where the name of Linux comes from, but that's him. He's a real nice guy. Um, actually born the same year that I was born. He's a little younger than me, but he's now a Finnish American because he lives in the United States and works over here. But he still controls actively and is involved in the Linux operating system. Now, really, things start way back with a operating system known as Unix. And Unix was actually an acronym at the time, so it was actually all capped like this, Unix instead of lowercase. And here in this picture, we can actually see where Unix came from. Unix was born in 1969, so it was born a long time ago, way back here. And this is a little chart, a little picture that kind of shows what happened with Unix. Unix was not originally free and open, but it became free and open. And so a Unix, it's kind of interesting to note. Unix started out very much like Linux did, and so they really needed an operating system that was going to be able to do everything that you wanted, including networking. So let's go all the way back to 1969 here and see what happened. So on the PDP-7, they needed an operating system and they created Unix. Two or three guys did. You can look that up and read about it. It's really, to me, it's very fascinating, but I don't want to take up hours talking about Unix. So Unix began to come out, and then what happened was basically AT&T wanted to buy that operating system, and the guys that sold it that worked for Bell, that's AT&T basically now, but back then it was all one, and then it split, and anyway, that's confusing. But any case, they created it, and they said, well, we'll go ahead and sell it to you, but we also want this other version of Unix to stay in the hands of academia so that we can just use it however we want to. And so at this time, basically what happened is it was forked. So anytime you take an operating system and you take it and change it to something, it's called forking. So you fork the OS and you do something different with that line. And that's what happened here. So it comes down, and System 3 and System 5 revision 1 and 2 become very popular. And if we go all the way to the bottom here, uh, and over, sorry, but this is the only way to really read it. You end up with following this line. Uh, uh, Sorry, my mouse keeps disconnecting there. So you keep following this line down, and this is AT&T that's dealing with that. And all the red, as this says, is closed source. And then these are mixed and shared sources. And so BSD is over here, and BSD is Berkeley Systems Distribution. So Berkeley, the college, right? So the university, and so that's the Berkeley system here. And so you can see that along the way it just keeps getting forked and forked. Sun, that company that is now owned by Oracle, which is where you get VirtualBox from. Sun originally created VirtualBox. It actually took BSD and it forked it into its Sun OS. And so look at all these. I mean, you end up with a bunch of different people. This is HP UX, so HP sold Unix as well, and that's extremely popular, and it still is going on today. HP UX 11i plus, and so is Solaris and Open Solaris, and so on. OpenBSD is eventually what happened to the Berkeley Systems distribution, and you can see way over here. This is the Mac server stuff, which is where Mac OS, or not, we don't use the 10 anymore, but Mac OS came from right here. And that's still, as you can see, that's an orange yellowish here. And that means that it's mixed. It's shared, meaning that it actually allows people to contribute to certain portions of it. And then way over here is something called Minix. And you can see that Minix is Unix-like systems. And here's Linux. And notice that Linux has got this really straight line, right? There's nothing else there, right? Just Linux. Well, that's not the whole story. What this is actually showing us, though, is that basically Linus pretty much took everything that he could from Unix. And how that happened is that he was in college and he was using Minix. And so Minix is actually something you can go out and get as an operating system. It's free and open source, and it was really designed to help you understand how an operating system works so you can build your own. And many educational institutions, when you take computer science classes, at some point you take a class where you actually build your own operating system so that you really understand what's happening. And Minix is like a stepping stone for that to help people understand it. And so he was using Minix, is what he was using. And part of Minix is that it had this abstraction layer. And that abstraction layer means that basically you could run Minix on anything. You can run it on x86, ARM, CPUs. You can run it on whatever you want. And how it did it was through a layer of programming that would translate and interpret what the hardware needed back and forth. And so Linus, you have to realize when this all happened, um, sorry, way over here, back when he really made this in the early 90s, over there in Europe, they just did not have what we had here. It sounds kind of strange, but this is kind of a portion of computer history that people aren't aware of. Things that Intel was making and everybody else were making here were actually considered trade secrets. So you couldn't just buy a computer. So if you were in Germany, you couldn't just go buy a computer. Instead, a company had to go through the process of selling computers there, and they had to open up a place to sell them. So, for instance, a company like IBM or Apple, they would have had a place to sell computers in different locations around the world. Places like Dell that were all online ordering, well, actually not online back then, but call them up and order. Gateway, those companies, HP even, you couldn't buy that stuff in Europe. And if you could, there was these tariffs put on them, and it was super expensive. So if you bought a computer over here that cost you, back then, $1,800 in today's money, what is that, like 3,400 bucks or something? It was $1,800 here. It was going to be double that over in Europe. And so the problem that Linus saw was that there was all these computers there, but they were all really old. So while we're dealing with Pentiums, and I know that you guys don't know what that is, but you can look it up. And, that was the big new architecture from Intel. They had 386s, and so you're really talking about 386 being, well, let's look at it this way, an Intel Pentium processor being 800 times better than a 386. And so our standard was much higher, and we could run Windows 95 by the time we got to Windows 95 and IBM OS 2, and we could run these things pretty quickly, but they couldn't. Windows 95 on a 386 is just atrocious to try to run. And really, if you were into technology there, what it meant is that you were a step behind. You were always just behind. And so in countries like that, things like the Amigas and the Ataris were very popular because they actually offered quite a bit of power that you couldn't get out of a Windows machine. And so he decided, well, what I need to do is take this idea from Minix and cut out that abstraction layer and make a really tightly programmed operating system for these really slow computers we have. And Linux was born. Now, the reason I show you all this stuff about Unix and what it's doing is that basically anybody from Europe could have gone out and gotten BSD. So when we look at the time frame, see, here's Linux right here in the 90s. Next step, OpenStep would have required too much processing power, but BSD wouldn't have. Here's 386 BSD. That sounds familiar. 386 processor, right? So you could have gone in and gotten that, right, from Berkeley Systems Distribution and run it. But there was another factor that was really feeding into this Linux becoming massive, and that you really can't underestimate that, and that's Linus himself. He was just a real friendly guy and he welcomed everybody's input. If you had a good idea, then he would spend time integrating it into a system. And in these other systems, your email's just basically lost. Somebody's looking at it eventually, and maybe 4 or 5 years from now, you might actually get what you said put into the operating system. He was working with a community of people, and he opened it up. Open source was already there, to tell you the truth, but Linux is really what pushed that out there, and so people could contribute and it could become part of these little committees that people would look at it and say, well, this looks good, let's go ahead and do that, and they would put it in. Linux stole a lot of stuff from Unix. As a matter of fact, there's a famous story where IBM, who obviously is seen as the man, as they say, um, saw that Linux was just exploding, and so they went out and bought a distribution of Linux, and I can't remember what it was, but they bought a distribution so they could get their systems working together and all that stuff. And a lot of the community of Linux actually started to sue IBM over this because they were taking all this and they were going to close it down and it wasn't going to be open source. And so then they just countersued. Basically, they didn't get the point of suing. There was all these threats, basically, and they basically said, "Okay, well, how about all of this code that we have written?" Things people don't understand that IBM's, I mean, they've got hands in almost everything. Here's all this code we've written in Unix, and look at that. It's in this portion of this Linux app. And then, of course, the whole argument went away, and it's like, okay, never mind, because basically there's tons and tons of Linux applications out there that just blatantly ripped off what was already being done in Unix. Having said that, that means there's this great um, interchange between Linux and Unix. So not only the names are very similar, but you can take a Linux app and port it to Unix very easily, or you can take a Unix app and port it to Linux very easily. So there's a lot of cross programming that happens there. Now, how did it get the name of Linux? Well, actually, this guy was operating out of a Unix server. And so when he actually decided, I'm going to share my operating system with the world, he didn't have a name for it. And he put this operating system into his folder that the system admin had created. And the system admin had a habit of doing this. Well, it's running Unix, right? So if your name is James, then we're going to take James, and James is going to equal Jamix. Or actually, I guess it's an UX, right? Jamix. So he would take the first portion of what your username was, and then he would add UX on the end of it because it was a Unix server. That's just what he did. It was his server. He got to do what he wants. So then you get, well, my name is Linus, and so we're going to make it Linux, right? So he puts it into his own folder that's called Linux, and it starts getting downloaded around Europe like crazy, and then eventually the US. And so it becomes Linux. That's what it's called because they pulled it out of that folder. He didn't actually name it after himself. It just got named that way. So that's pretty cool. Now, moving on. Here's a big deal. So he took it from Minix and created Linux. And as we saw in the chart, Minix is heavily associated with Unix. So they basically looked at what they were doing and, for lack of a better way of putting it, copied it. Linux is super popular, but it's got this forking problem. It's got this problem where it just gets divided out into different things. And so I know you can't see this. We're going to zoom in on this. But these are different distributions of Linux and how these different other distributions have been forked off of them, how they've been moved and done something else. As a matter of fact, when we look here, it says Android and Chrome OS. So basically what Google did was they took the Linux operating system and they forked it into Android and Chrome OS. Now once you do that, then basically you're saying the development of this is now different than what it was before. And so that's how we get these distributions. The actual Linux operating system if I can find the tab I'm looking for, right, is just this Linux 0 all the way down to Linux 5. And that's what we call the kernel, the Linux kernel spelled with a K. And then the different distributions put that kernel into their distribution. So we're using the OpenSUSE distribution. So now we're going to take a look at this file. So this is zoomed in. So let's come up. I think we'll figure out where we are here. Okay, so there's Debian. That was a main distribution that came out at the time. And then there was another distribution that came out. These are all different distributions that are not connected to anything. Monkey. And then SLS, whoops, sorry, went back there. Slackware was another huge one. That's SLS, Slackware. And there's SUSE. And there's SUSE. And then as that comes down, you could still follow SUSE, and then there's OpenSUSE. So basically what happened with SUSE is that a very big networking company known as Novell was really getting smashed in that area. So networking, they used to be king prior to Windows 95, and they were losing market like crazy. And so they got onto this bandwagon of let's go out and get a distribution. So they purchased SUSE. And once they purchased SUSE, they also have this OpenSUSE. So if you go with this networking company, they'll set you up with servers and email and storage and how to manage it all. And then you can use their desktop systems that all run SUSE. And then as part of SUSE, I mean, it's really very much like Windows. You don't even need Windows. You don't pay them licensing or anything. You just run SUSE. As a part of that, anything they develop in SUSE, they eventually push out into OpenSUSE. So eventually you get everything that's a part of that. And that's why we actually use OpenSUSE, is because it's a very, very complete distribution. There's tons of distributions, and we'll look at one that's very popular here in a minute, but there's tons of them. We could have went with all sorts of different distributions, but I did OpenSUSE because it's very, very compatible in function to what Windows is. In other words, if I was going to replace Windows 10, I could get OpenSUSE and feel satisfied with that. I wouldn't be like, well, how do I do this? And how come you can't do that? OpenSUSE is incredibly robust. That's why it's 4 gigs that you have to download. Anyway, moving down, Red Hat was another one. Red Hat was a massive distribution that was used, Red Hat Enterprise, and that's opened up, and it's now Oracle Enterprise. But see, every single one of these that comes off of here is a fork, and it's a different distribution. So CentOS is very, very popular. See if there's any others I was going to look at on OpenSUSE. Mandrake is very popular. It's come down. It's now these different ones, Chameleon OS. And here we are with coming up to Slackware. Ubuntu's in here someplace. Ubuntu's a huge one that people go off of, and these days Mint is really, really popular. There's Ubuntu, that's not the same. And so anyway, the point is that, man, you can really see that there are tons and tons. There's WebOS, tons of different distributions available out here. And they all have different things that they do. Some of them, see, there's Lindows that became Linspire, and now it's FreeSpire. So what's the difference between these? Well, look and feel is definitely different between these. There's Mint, as I was talking about. That's a very, very popular one, Linux Mint. And they're all used for different things. That's the problem with Linux, right? Once you fork this, yes, they can all be running the latest version of the Linux kernel. But how they've implemented things, how you get around in it, what things you can do with the command line are all very different, right? So Knoppix was massive and it's split off into tons of things. So when you really look at Linux, you have to understand that Linux is extremely, extremely popular out there. But where it's popular is usually on the server side of things. There's hardly any web server that's not running a version of Linux. There is also hardly any networking equipment that's not running some version of Linux. So firewalls, routers, all that stuff is running some kind of version of Linux or Unix. It may have come from FreeBSD, but that's huge. It's massive. So if you were to just say, let's look at all computing devices, and let's say what operating system is on there. Is it Windows, or is it Linux, or is it Unix? You're going to find out that the majority of them are Linux and Unix, not Windows. But when you look at PCs, right, then it's Windows. And almost all these have some version that you can run that's kind of like Windows, but Windows owns everything. I think it's interesting because when you look at mobile, right, your phone, if you're running Android, that's Linux. So we call it Android, but it's actually a version of Linux. If you're running iOS, that's Unix. That's a version of Unix, and that goes back to this chart. So they don't actually, they show Mac OS right here. They don't actually have iOS, but iOS and iPad OS are just Mac OS trimmed down. So they should have that listed here too. But lots of people, they're afraid of Macs, so they don't put that stuff in. So I want to show you, here's a place called DistroWatch. So once we take the Linux kernel and we put it into something, we pack it into a distribution. And there's so many distributions coming out and updated that this website actually shows you all these different distributions. And really, like, here's the new Linux Mint that came out, and this is the new distribution of it, and it actually describes it. This, it's installation of NVIDIA drivers included. So there's a lot of things, like when you're really doing I want to do gaming, I want to have an awesome machine, you have to really look at, okay, which Linux distribution am I going to use, because it may not support anything that I want to use, right? There's tons of them. So here's the rank of the distributions. Mint, again, is very high. There's Ubuntu, very high as you go down. CentOS. And they're just tracking who's downloading what from their site on this. So I wanted to show you Distribution Watch so you could actually distro watch, so you could actually check it out and see what's out there and do a little research on your own, because the assignments are not hugely demanding in this. They're not going to take you much time, and hopefully you'll poke around and see what's happening out there. Okay, so last thing I'm going to talk about in this little video to get you screen capture, to get you going, is that on top of these distributions you can actually have different GUIs. And so we're using a particular GUI. We're going to look at the other one that's very popular, and that's GNOME. And you can call it GNOME, or you can call it GNOME. And you'll notice, well, I'm not getting anywhere here with gnomes because they're so popular. So we'll put GNOME Linux. And so you can have this graphical user interface running on top of your system, and this is what it looks like. So no matter what distribution you get, you can actually choose a different graphical user interface. There's XLED, there's NextStep, OpenStep or LightStep, and then of course we're using KDE. So there's a ton of them out there if you want to do a little research. KDE is very popular too. And so it really does get complicated, because you've got the Linux kernel you're running, then you've got the distribution that you're using, and then what graphical system you're using on top of that. It may not be KDE. Just add Linux to that. And actually a lot of your help files are going to take you to KDE. It'll take you to the Plasma desktop, so that you can, they've got their own little helps basically. And then this is what it looks like. This is smoother and more fun, sure, whatever. There are certain applications made for KDE and other applications that are made for GNOME. Those are the two biggest ones. but there's also ones for Lightstep. There's tons of them. You know, you saw the Linux distributions. It's almost as bad for GUI interfaces on Linux. But it is a lot of fun, and that's why people that are really into operating systems, like myself, will have different distributions and different graphical systems just because it's a kick. You know, it's just a lot of fun to go and look at all the different stuff. So you're going to look at KDE. Then you have to realize that. It's like, okay, well, what distribution are you using? OpenSUSE. Well, what graphical interface are you using? KDE. And KDE has this thing known as Plasma, right? And learn about Plasma, that's actually where some of your help files actually take you to. And you need to look at those. You need to read those. It's like your textbook. I've made that free, right, to you. Again, Ubuntu is very popular, or Mint. So if you're going to do a different distro, I would take a look at Mint. I like it better than Ubuntu. I've had some unsuccessful things happen in Ubuntu, so I usually don't use them. But there's different distributions per country. You can look at all the distributions that are just in the U.S. And you could look at a German distribution or a French distribution. It's incredible. Anyway, so this is Plasma and what it looks like, and we'll get into how you can customize it and do different things with it, and graphically make it what you want using widgets and panels. Those are customizable things that we'll take a look at. All right, that's it for this one. The next ones we'll actually get into the assignments on this is what you're going to do the assignments, and I'll probably add a few things in as we go along through those.